Hey folks, welcome back to week 1 of GID216, Motion Graphics for Interactive Media. Okay, so now that we've gone over sort of the general overview of the class, all the different links within Blackboard, a little bit of our syllabus, and sort of how the class is going to operate, let's dive into the content for our very first week. So we are in week 1, so therefore we go to modules and projects, and we go to module 1, which is week 1. And so again, our goal this week, of course, was to introduce the course, which we just did in the last video. And so the main thing we're going to do here is go over the visual literacy principles that we're going to cover in this class. And like I said in the last video, there are 8 of them. Seeing versus looking, artistic representation, pictograms and icons, logos and branding marks, narrative contraction and expansion, the role of color, an imperfect tool, typography and letter forms, and semiotics made simple. Now we're going to cover each one of these over subsequent weeks. So in between the weeks where we're working on Adobe After Effects and working on our motion graphics projects, we are going to be covering these 8 visual literacy principles. Now this week we're just going to do a very quick overview of all 8 of them, just so that you can get sort of a high level understanding of what's coming up. I don't want you to be introduced to them for the first time when we get to them week by week, right? Okay, then we're going to take a look at this week's discussion board topic, and then you guys will go off and complete this week's discussion board. The other thing you're going to do this week while working on a discussion board and getting to know everything that's in Blackboard is, of course, make sure that you download and set up Adobe After Effects on your computer, and of course make sure you've got Photoshop and Illustrator up and running, okay? I'll remind you of this at the end. All right, so let's take a look at our overview of the 8 different visual literacy principles. Okay, so this first thing here, now normally when I give this presentation in class, it's a little more interactive, of course, but we don't really get to do that here because we're working asynchronously. So I'm just going to sort of talk you through this, right? Okay, so what do we have here? Well, this, of course, is a photograph of an apple. Now, normally when I say this to students, that's what they say. They say, well, it's a photograph of an apple. But then the next thing I really want you to do is take a closer look at it and start making some determinations about the different things that you see, and then using critical thinking and your ability to sort of extrapolate information, try to tell me more of a story about this apple other than, hey, it's a picture of an apple, right? It's obviously a picture of an apple. But what else is going on here? So a couple of things. For one thing, the apple is wet, right? There are drops of water all over this apple. So what does that tell you? Think about that for a minute. The apple is not sitting on a counter. It's not at a supermarket. Where is it? It's hanging on a tree, which means it's probably in an apple orchard. How do we know it's on an apple tree? Well, it's hanging from this branch. You can see the leaves. You can see the greenery in the background, which is blurry and out of focus. And of course, we can see the shapes of some other apples going on in the background. So this tells it's definitely hanging on an apple tree, probably in an orchard somewhere. And of course, the leaves are all nice and brightly colored green. The apple is nice and red, so it's ripe. And so by knowing those things, we can start thinking about what is the story of this apple, right? Yes, it's an apple, but it's way more than that, right? So you can start telling me about why is the apple wet? Why is the tree wet? What happened? Did it rain? Did it rain recently? Did it rain the night before? Was there a rainstorm? Was it a light drizzle? Perhaps it didn't rain. Maybe it's a sunny day. Maybe the people who run the apple orchard were just out watering the trees. Maybe they were walking around with hoses and sprinklers watering the trees. Maybe it's on an automated sprinkling system. Maybe that comes on a certain time of day to keep the trees nice and wet. Who knows? But the point is, your job is to try to start extrapolating what is this story. Now, of course, from a design point of view, from a visual design point of view, if you were making a film or a video or a commercial or whatever, you could show this image. This could be a video or a still image or whatever. And the idea is the audience will get an idea about what the story is because of what they bring to the conversation. Make sense? So just like I'm asking you to ask all these questions of it, we basically do this kind of automatically. You say, yeah, it's an apple, but then if I asked you some contradicting questions and I said, well, is this an apple in a supermarket? You'd say, no, that's not an apple in a supermarket. That's an apple hanging on a tree. Oh, okay. So is this apple dirty? Is this apple old? Is this apple beaten up? No, it's a nice brand new apple. Okay, so this is a green apple, right? No, it's a red apple, obviously. So do you see how this works? Not only can you start telling a story about this photograph in your head by answering these questions that you pose to yourself, but you can also look at the opposite situation that you're not seeing. And all of that adds to a really rich narrative about this. Now, what if we started talking about some elements that we don't see in the photograph, right? We mentioned that perhaps a worker at the apple orchard came out and started watering the trees. Well, what's that person's name? What do they do? How long have they worked at the apple orchard? What do they do when they go home? Where do they live? Do they have a family? Do they have pets? And we could go on and on and on. And now you could tell a whole story about the person who watered the apple tree. So just with this one photograph of an apple, we have probably given ourselves enough questions and enough counter questions that you could probably write a couple of thousand words about everything about this apple, everything about this orchard, and everything about the people who work at this orchard, right? You could make up an entire story just from this one photo. So that's the difference between sort of looking and really seeing. So naturally, we get through life by seeing things all the time, right? If you had to sort of rethink everything that you saw from the minute you got up every day, you'd have a hard time getting through life. But think about when you're a baby, right? When children are small and we're teaching them different things, we might show them a picture of an apple, and they're babies and they don't know how to talk yet, and they're still learning language and trying to understand what shapes and objects are. And you might hold up a picture of an apple and say, apple, apple, right? Because you're trying to get them to understand the word and relate it to the object. You might hold up a real apple and say the same thing to them. You might take a bite of the apple in front of them and say, look, apple, so that they get the idea that, oh, I can eat this. This is food. And then you might give them a piece of apple to try, and maybe they'll mash it around in their mouth a little bit or whatnot. Either way, there are various steps that are taken to try to get some understanding between language, objects, and functionality. The language is, what is it called? How do we talk about it? What is the object? What does it do? What does it feel like? What does it look like? What color is it? And what do we do with it? What's its purpose, right? Do we throw this thing? Do we play with it? No, we eat it. And so all of these things play a role in the visual literacy of the situation, right? So that as you get older, you wake up in the morning, you walk down in the kitchen, you see a basket full of apples. You don't have to stand there and say, wait a minute, what are those red things? I have no idea what those are. Let me think about it. You just know, right? Your subconscious brain is like, oh, apple, got it. I'm going to eat an apple. And you go from there. And so the ability to identify these things, what it is, how do you talk about it, what do you do with it, gets moved from our conscious brain when you're first learning about it to your subconscious brain where you already know it. And it becomes like shorthand, right? Everything in life is like that. And visual objects really play a big role in our lives because of that. If you think about the complexity of each object, of each situation, just like we went through this apple photograph, you will see that there's a lot to know just by looking at one thing, right? But luckily, our ability to understand things and commit them to our subconscious memory helps us get through life. Now, this is important because as an artist and a designer, when you are presenting things to an audience, you can be rest assured that your audience has an inherent understanding of the object already. You don't have to explain to them what an apple in an orchard is. They know. Okay, next slide. So again, here's another question, right? What is this? Well, you're like, oh, it's an apple, right? But is this the same sort of apple as this apple? No, of course not. Whereas this is an apple hanging in an orchard on a tree with all those things we talked about. This is an apple that has been altered, right? This is an apple sitting on a white background. It may or may not be sitting on a white bottom. This could be photoshopped in. This could be a fake shadow. Could be a real shadow. This apple has obviously been put together to look pretty perfect. It's got the one stem, the one perfect leaf, right? It's a nice shape. It's nicely red, but it's a real apple, right? It's just been altered. So it's like one step taken away from reality. But we still see it as an apple. The story that you could construct about this apple is different than the story you would tell about this apple, right? Because there's different amounts of information, different types of information. All right, next. What about this? Still an apple, right? Still got the one stem, the one leaf on a white background. But again, this is a very different apple than this one. Why? Because this is a photograph, so therefore it has a certain amount of realism to it. And this is a drawing of an apple. And so because of the choice to draw this apple and the media that is used to draw this apple, whether this is crayon or colored pencil or Conti crayon or whatever this might be, this is an artistic representation of an apple. So again, because of those choices, it does two things. It removes the apple further from reality, and it gives you the ability to tell a different story about this apple. Who drew this apple? Why did they draw the apple this way? What's their story? Okay. Next, what's this? Also an apple, right? Now, this is a pictogram of an apple. This is a black and white rendition of an apple. Looks like cut paper, right? It's done digitally, but it looks like it could be made from cut paper. This is a graphic of an apple. And yet most people would have no difficulty understanding that this is an apple, this is an apple, this is an apple, and this is an apple, right? So we get what it is no matter how it's presented to us. But this serves a very different purpose than this. This is a drawing. This is also a representation of an apple that's not real, like the drawing. It's done digitally in black and white using shapes, almost like geometry, right? But it's not the same as this. And so therefore you can tell a different story about this apple than you could tell about this apple. What is the purpose of this sort of representation of an object? Speed. You want to be able to look at this quickly and just say apple. This is why emojis, pictograms, icons, things that we see on signage, like on the highway, make for perfect ways to communicate large amounts of information quickly. While this has just the right amount of detail for somebody to understand, oh, apple, I got it. This is an artistic representation that is meant to have a much larger story. Even more so, right? Here, we're just trying to get across the basic concept of apple as quickly as possible. Okay, what's this? Oh, still an apple, but this is a familiar apple, right? This is the Apple logo. More specifically, the Apple Computer Company logo. So the company that makes iPhones and Macintosh computers and Apple Watches and all those fun things, their logo is of an apple because that's the name of their company. So is this really different than this? Well, it's the same kind of representation, right? It's flat black and white using geometric shapes done digitally. Same idea, right? Flat black and white using geometric shapes done digitally. It's a different look, but it's still just an apple. Oop, we'll get to that one in a minute. So it's still just an apple, right? The difference is that this one, because it is a logo, it is the brand identity of a worldwide company that we're all familiar with, the story of this apple is very different than the story of this apple. So this is meant to convey some basic information very quickly. This is meant to convey some complex information very quickly. Because Apple as a company is a much more complex conversation than this pictogram of an apple, right? Because this tells you all sorts of different things. It talks about the computer company. It talks about the company that handles the iPhones. It talks about all their software and services. It talks about their history. It talks about the people who started the company. Maybe you have experience with them. Maybe you've had a good experience with Apple. Maybe you've had a bad experience with Apple. Either way, your personal experience with them plays into the story that you could tell about this specific Apple. Whereas this, maybe not so much. This is maybe just a pretty simple story about an apple. So, as you can see, even though the visual representation of these apples changes from really simple to a little less simple, to a little less simple, to pretty complex, to very complex, the story that you can tell about each one of these is vastly different. Okay, so that's sort of seeing versus looking. It also talks about pictograms and iconography. It also talks about narrative contraction and expansion, and we'll talk more about that as we go. All right, next, let's take a look at color. And yes, we're sticking with apples. I know you're probably thinking, what is with all the apples? Okay, so the subtitle of our section on color is an imperfect tool. Why are we calling color imperfect? Well, color is imperfect for a couple of reasons. Number one, the main reason is that everybody sees color differently. When we get to the week on color, we're going to talk a lot about why everybody sees color differently. Humans all see color differently. Color is actually a man-made construct. Red, green, blue, yellow, all those colors, they don't really exist. It's all in how we see them as light is refracted from the back of our eyes into our heads, and your brain translates the color. As a society, we sort of agree that red is red, blue is blue, green is green. But are they real? Well, not really. They're kind of like man-made. Same thing with time, if we're really talking about it. So as a result, you really can't understand how accurate color is because everybody sees it differently. How do I know this? Well, simple. Try going to a Home Depot or a Lowe's and pick out some paint colors with some friends. Maybe you want to repaint the living room in your house or something, and you go down there and you're like, hey, let's pick out some paint colors. What are the chances you're going to agree that a color looks exactly the same, right? One person might say, oh, that's kind of a blue-green, while somebody else might look at the same paint swatch and say, oh, that's kind of a green-blue, right? Neither one of them is wrong. It's just that they see it differently. Their eyes function differently. And so therefore color is an imperfect tool. The other reason color is an imperfect tool is because the reproduction and representation of color, particularly in a digital environment, is going to change depending on the deliverable. What does that mean? Well, for print purposes, when we are printing on t-shirts or posters or books or whatever, we are using a color model called CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, which is represented over here on the left by this apple. So this graphic of an apple was designed in Adobe Illustrator using the CMYK color model. Now, this exact same apple was simply switched over to the color model of RGB, red, green, blue, which is used for screen projection, whether it be on the web, on a phone, on a projector, in any variety of software, on a television, whatever. RGB is the color model that we use for light-based representation. And so when you switch this apple from the CMYK color model to the RGB color model, this is what you get. Look at the switch. Nothing was changed. None of the colors were manually altered. It just visually changes because even though the CMYK color model can create millions of colors, and even though the RGB color model can create millions of colors, they're not all the same colors. And so therefore, with some colors, there's a transition. And so that's the other reason that color is an imperfect tool. So why don't we just abandon color, right? If it's so problematic, why not just skip it? Well, we can't because we live in a full color world. And meanwhile, we're not even talking about people who have a certain amount of color blindness. So we'll get into this when we talk about the week on color. Okay, now of course the other part of color is the discussion about the psychology of color, which is also an imperfect science. In fact, I wouldn't even call it a science. It's more of a social science. The way we see color and what color means in terms of adjectives and how it gets people to do things or think certain ways is entirely a subjective experience. So we'll learn a little bit about this. And of course, color is applied to branding and logos, which are supposed to make consumers feel certain ways and do certain things. How accurate is that? I don't know. We'll talk about that when we get to our color week. But this is something to start considering. And of course, we've mentioned color models. There's a long history of color models. It dates back to the 15th century and maybe even a little bit before that. And so there's a history of color models that we'll get into, and it's all basically mankind's attempt to really sort of understand how we see color, how best to understand that, present it, and then replicate it. So we'll go through that when we get to our week on color as well. Okay, next we'll talk about typography. Now, of course, visual literacy isn't just about things like photographs and paintings and color. It's also about letter forms. Now, you might think, well, wait a minute, isn't that reading or phonics or writing or grammar? Well, yes, it is, but it's also the visual representation of letter forms that form sounds in our brain which help us understand language. And again, this is something you learn as a small child. So when we get to typography, we're going to talk about these letter forms. You're probably wondering, why are these letters overlapping each other? Why are they upside down? Why are they sideways? Well, we're going to talk about that. And of course, there's opportunities for what we call readability. Now, if you've taken a typography class, which you probably have, and you've studied this in your other graphic design classes, you'll know that readability is not literacy. It is not the ability to read something as if you understand the language. It is the ability to present letter forms and words in a way that the audience can understand while still making it visually interesting or visually challenging. Like this one. What does this say? Go ahead, I'll give you a second. Yeah, that didn't take you long, right? It says hidden, even though half of the word is missing. In fact, you could say that half of the word is hidden. So it's kind of a visual pun, right? But you should not have had any trouble reading this because only showing 50% of the letters, only showing the top half of the letters, still gives your brain plenty of information to be able to read this. What does that tell you? it tells you that our ability to read has almost superpowers in that from a design point of view, you can really play around with your letter forms, challenge your audience, and still maintain readability. You've got to find that balance. Okay, we'll talk about things like this, which is sort of scale and perspective using letter forms. We'll talk about negative space with regard to letter forms, right? And we're going to talk about personality of fonts. Just like colors have certain personalities in psychologies, fonts have certain personalities and sort of ideas behind them that we understand as a society and we sort of cop to, right? We look at something and say, yeah, that seems right. And why does that seem right? Take a look at these. Think about it. Which one seems right to you? Why does that seem right? What happens when you switch it? All right, we'll get to that. Okay, pictograms. We are going to spend a good amount of time looking at pictograms. We're going to spend 1 week on pictograms. Try to guess what all of these mean. A well-designed, simplified pictogram is really difficult to do. So when we get to pictograms, we're going to talk about a couple of things. We're going to talk about the visual representation of larger ideas using simplistic graphics, which is what a pictogram is. And we're going to talk about the idea of scufomorphism and how certain pictures get trapped in time because they become our visual representation of something, even though the modern equivalent of that might be different. Hint, take a look at the television. Does anybody own a television that looks like this anymore? Not really. But we still understand that this is a television. Why is that? Okay, and lastly, we're going to talk about semiotics. Now, semiotics is a pretty complex psychological study that talks about the idea of signifiers and signified. It talks about symbols and how they get people to do certain things. So, for example, this is an exit sign. You've seen these a million times. This is what you call a signifier. This is telling you to do something using basic visual graphics. It has some letter forms that spell out the word exit. It uses a very specific color, red, which indicates something severe or important. And it uses some simple graphics like arrows and rectangles. So this collection of visual elements is a signifier. It's telling you to do something. What is it telling you to do? This. It's telling you to leave, right? It's telling you to get out of the building. It's telling you to go somewhere else. Now, even though this doesn't look anything like this, we know that this is telling us to do this, right? So it's a universal understanding. That's the basics of semiotics. Yes, semiotics is a little more complicated than that, but we're going to go over the basics of it and try to understand how collectively as a society we understand that these basic shapes mean to go do this. So, for example, this symbol means something. It's telling you to do something. What's it telling you to do? Well, it's telling you to throw away your trash, right? But is it telling you to do this? Is it telling you to put your trash in cans like this, nice and neat? Or is it telling you to do this? Throw your trash on the ground and just, get rid of it. Which is it? Which is the most accurate one? So we have to make sure that our symbols in the world of semiotics are accurately depicting what we want it to tell us to do. Now, obviously in this one, there is a graphic of a trash can, so we can all determine that it's asking us to do this, not this. But you want to make sure we're clear on that. So that's semiotics. Okay, so those are the basic tenets of visual literacy that we are going to cover in this class. Now, before we exit out of this video, we are going to take a look at what's expected for this week's discussion, and then you can hop into that. And then this is going to play into our very first area of visual literacy, seeing versus looking. All right, so under the first discussion is some information about this guy here, Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio. My Italian is terrible, I apologize. So he, of course, was an Italian painter active in Rome, Naples, Malta, and Sicily from about 1590s, somewhere in the 1590s to about 1610, which is when he died. His paintings combine a realistic observation of the human state, both physical and emotional, with a dramatic use of lighting, which had a formative influence on Baroque painting. Now, you're probably thinking, why are we learning this? This is not an art history class. No, it's not. But Caravaggio did a great job of not only making beautiful and engaging realistic paintings, but in putting in all sorts of hidden meaning into his paintings and leaving room for the viewer, which is a concept in fine art that really invites you as the viewer to get into the painting, right? So So here's some more information about Caravaggio. You can read that. It's also available in the discussion, so you can learn a little bit about him. Now, the goal of the discussion is that you're going to take a look at this painting. It's called The Supper at Emmaus. It was painted in 1601, and this is the painting. You're going to take a look at it. Now, it's available in discussion 1, so you don't have to stare at it here if you don't want to. It's also easy to find online, The Supper at Emmaus. And you're going to study this painting and take a look at it, and then answer a bunch of questions about it in the discussion, okay? Make sure you follow the rules of the discussion. Make sure you put a lot of thought into your answer and answer the discussion prompt properly using the minimum amount of words that are required. So put a lot of thought into it, and then go respond to at least 2 of your classmates. There's a lot to unpack in this painting. There's a lot going on, right? Remember I talked about leaving room for the viewer? I'll give you a hint. Notice that right here, there's no chair. Who's supposed to be sitting there? You, the viewer, right? And there's all sorts of other things to figure out here, from what they're wearing to the positions of their bodies to the way they're expressing themselves to the colors of the painting. Who are these people? What is this story? So lots of questions to answer and unpack here. So that's your discussion this week, is to really study this painting, answer the given questions, and then start up a conversation with your classmates about this painting. It's a great painting. All right, so that's it for this week. So lots to do this week. Really get to know Blackboard. Take a look at everything to know about the class. Really get yourself settled. Get your software ready to rock and roll. And dive into this week's discussion and have a good time with it. All right, if you have any questions, thoughts, concerns, or whatever, be sure to email me or poke into the weekly office hours on Monday or Friday. I will see you then.